Welcome to the Well Off Podcast, where the goal is to motivate, inspire, and share success principles. I'm your host, Georges El-Masri. On this episode, I interviewed Serena Holmes. Prior to becoming a realtor, Serena ran her own brand experience agency for around 18 years. She grew the agency to 10 full-time and over 2,200 part-time staff across the country, and she currently focuses on working as a realtor and active real estate investor. She also hosts a podcast called Inspired to Invest. On this episode, we discuss selling her business to focus on other ventures, how networking and real estate events altered her life, private lending, pitfalls to avoid, and mistakes she's made. So obviously there's been a lot of stuff in the media these days about private lending and some people that have been in trouble and that sort of thing. So just a couple things that, a couple tips for people to avoid getting into those kinds of situations. And then we also talked a little bit about secured loans and promissory notes, the differences between the two and the risks associated. So I think you guys are going to enjoy this episode. Serena was fun to talk to. She's very knowledgeable when it comes to private lending. If you do enjoy the content, then please do share it with a friend or family member and leave us a review. That would be greatly appreciated because, again, reviews help us get the word out there to spread a good message with more people. And finally, I encourage you to go to www.welloff.ca/podcast to check out some free reports and things that we offer. And you can also connect with me while you're there. So I hope you'll enjoy the episode. All right, I'm here with Serena Holmes. It's nice to meet you. We've been talking for a little bit, and I'm glad to have you in our office here. I like to start off by asking you a little bit about your childhood. So if you want to tell me where you grew up, a couple things you remember.
All right. So I initially grew up until I was 5 in Scarborough. It's actually in the heart of Malvern. And then my parents separated, and a lot of chaos ensued at that point. I actually wrote a book about it called The Accidental Entrepreneur. So it really starts from when everything fell apart. But essentially my parents split up, and then my brother went to go live with my dad and my stepmom, and he basically died in an accident about 6 weeks after moving in with them. So everything went from bad to worse. I ended up going to live with them about a year later because my mom was just finding it, hard to kind of get through life at that point in time. So I lived with them for 6 years. Did not have a great relationship with my stepmom. She was abusive in different ways, and ended up going to live with an aunt and uncle for the remainder of my school years. So it's a little hectic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. So what age was it that you were living with your stepmom and your dad?
Yeah. So my brother passed away when I was 6, and I moved in with them a year later.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Really young.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, sorry to hear that. That's a tough start. And was he your only sibling?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did that lead to you becoming an entrepreneur?
Yeah. So I think going to the point of living with my aunt and uncle, it's not like I was homeless. It's not like I was disadvantaged in the sense of like not having food in my stomach or clothes on my back. But when you're living with people who are not your parents, I think you're grateful for what they're giving you, but you don't want to ask for anything more, right? So I was always like out there trying to have jobs and provide for myself and things like that. And I always had, in university, like 3 or 4 different jobs, and started to work with a company called Tigress, which was a brand ambassador and event staffing agency, and was basically offered the opportunity to come on board as a manager. And then that led into partnership very soon after. So I think just because I was always kind of like had those scrappy survival skills, like just trying to make ends meet and stuff like that, I just fell into entrepreneurship really by accident. Like I had no intention of ever running my own business or anything like that. It just kind of happened. So.
Right. And that company, so Tigress, right? Mm-hmm. You were with them for a while, isn't it?
Yeah, 18 years. Yeah. Okay. I just sold it 2 years ago.
So what exactly were you doing there? I don't really understand that that kind of business there. So just share with us.
So it was all experiential marketing and event staffing. So it was kind of as much or as little as somebody wanted. Like it could be as simple as 2 event staff for a golf tournament. It could be hundreds of staff. It could be, can you build us a 500-pound alarm clock for a viral video campaign? It could be shutting down a street in Toronto for a street festival, stage productions, retail programs. So it depended on what people wanted, but essentially we could operate here in Toronto or all across Canada, and then eventually moved into the States. Mm-hmm. And because our online presence was so strong, we had clients literally all around the world, across the States, like the government of South Australia even hired us for things that were happening here in Canada and again, eventually into the States. Yeah.
And so 18 years doing that, I think I see here that you sold it in 2022.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what was the reason? It sounds like, I mean, if you're doing something for 18 years, you probably enjoyed it, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
What was the reason for the change?
Yeah. I mean, I grew to the business to 10 of us full-time and 2,200 part-time. And my daughter was born in December of 2019. And I had someone on my team that had been with me for 6 years that I groomed to basically be my mat leave replacement. So she was responsible for all the incoming sales and managing our team. And then she quit when my daughter was 2 months old. So, obviously I was like, what do I do now? Like, I've got this big team, my office, like we were pretty high volume at that point in time. And I just didn't know how I'd be able to manage an infant at home and run the business when I obviously planned to take a step back for a little while. So I hired a mergers and acquisitions company to value the company and sell it. And then we went into lockdown 2 weeks later.
Oh, yeah.
So it was just the perfect storm. Like, we went from being a very busy, robust company to, I think we had like 400,000 in our booked business. It went up in smoke, $1 million in our pipeline that disappeared. So I basically had to let my entire team go except for one person. And I just kept her so that business could continue. Like, we knew that we wouldn't be in lockdown all the time. So in the fall, when things loosened up, we could do a bit of work. Then we were back in lockdown and, had that roller coaster running. And during that time, the mergers and acquisition company presented different companies to possibly buy us, and they just didn't feel like the right fit, like a mom and pop that had never done this before. And so I suggested, why don't you talk to other agencies that do what we do? They would see the value of our online presence. And that didn't really lead to anywhere as well. And then the girl that stayed with me for 2 years beyond COVID starting ended up resigning. And I was like, I felt like I had my back against the wall. Like, I don't feel like I had it in me to scale back up to where we were as quickly as I'd need to when we knew things were turning around and we were kind of coming out of all the pandemic stuff. Like, I had no more office, I had no more staff in terms of full-time staff. And I just said, can I get a mutual release? And then I went and had calls with a dozen agencies, and I had 4 offers in 2 weeks, and I closed 2 weeks after that.
Wow.
So
yeah, that must have been really tough. Like, there's so many businesses that were impacted at that time.
Yeah.
I'm sure the value of your business must have decreased significantly from all the lockdowns and whatnot.
I mean, it did in some ways. So I think when we were valued, it was a certain amount. But at the same time, I came out of those 2 years with more money in the bank than I had going into it, because we took advantage of, subsidies that were available and grants and things like that. So I'm not going to say I made quite as much money as maybe I could have, and it would have been easier to just be like a one-shot type of sale had I known that this person wasn't committed to see my mat leave through. I could have entertained that sooner. But I mean, it would be maybe like an incremental difference, maybe like a $30,000 to $40,000 difference. So I think the person I decided to merge with was obviously very trustworthy. They kind of hit the ground running with everything. They're already doing this kind of work. So they're able to, convert some of those clients into even bigger clients and stuff like that. So it's not like I just shut the doors. Like, I did come out with an earnout and, kind of kept that through. So it just ended, I guess, December 31st of last year to have it completed.
Are you still involved at all in the company?
No.
Okay, that's great. Well, I mean, congrats on the sale or the merger, however you structured it. And while you were doing that, so during your 18 years, were you doing private lending? Were you doing stuff like that along the way?
Not in the beginning. Like, it all kind of started when I sold my first rental property. So I had a short-term rental, and I just didn't know what to do next. So I kept the money in the bank for a year, and I was like, I don't know what to do. Like, what do I do next? And then we started staffing events with Keyspire in Texas and Florida, and they're a real estate education company. And I didn't really know anything much about them except that Scott McGilvery is kind of their face of the brand, and we had pictures of our staff with him. And then I went to one of their 1-hour wealth tour events, and they allude to all these different ways that you can make money that I'd never heard of. Like, you just think of buying a rental property and being a landlord, but there's all these other ways that you can make money in real estate that the average person probably doesn't know. So I went to then their 2-day event, and then it led into their membership. And then I went to their investors summit and took a lot of action. I ended up buying a couple of pre-construction properties, investing in 3 syndicated mortgages and a land development deal. And then I was talking to a friend of mine, and she's like, oh, if you're doing all this stuff, like, you should consider private lending. Like, I've got a mortgage broker that I work with, and it's really good money. And, so I set aside some money off my HELOC to work with him. So I think it was like $100,000 I put aside, and worked on a few private lends in that first year. And then as time passed, we would do anywhere from maybe like 3 to 6 deals a year. And then through the KeySpire network, I wanted to kind of ramp that up. And I met a woman that, when I expressed that I wanted to expand what I was doing, we had a call and she introduced me to a whole bunch of people that she trusted. And I was able to kind of expand my private lending that way.
Cool. And this was just for context, what year roughly?
Beginning of 2022, when I really started to like expand it further. Yeah.
And your first private lending deal was at 2022 as well, or
2018?
Oh, 2018 was your first one, right? Okay, 2018. So you started off with the short-term rental. You sold that. You had some cash, and then you do a staffing job, I guess, for KeySpire through your company.
Yeah.
And that's what leads to you eventually going down the path of private lending. It's pretty cool that works.
Yeah,
right?
it was one thing after another, right? Like I joined their organization. Through that, there's a really robust network. There's over 3,000 members. So, there's constantly people raising money. So like if you want, you could probably do a few deals every day. There's no shortage of opportunities where people need money and people want to place money, right? So, but you don't want to just hand that out to anyone. So it was nice to have that trusted referral. And, even now there's been, I guess, 2-3 years have passed, and some of those people that woman had referred are still like the best borrowers that I've worked with.
Mm-hmm. So what would you consider a good borrower?
Yeah, I think dependent, obviously, like if you're relying on that for monthly cash flow, like you need to make sure that things are transparent, they're trustworthy, they're dependable. If payouts are due, like I think ideally if someone needs that payout, you need to facilitate a new lender. I have learned a lot of tough lessons in the last few months when things have not necessarily gone as planned. But I think it's just important to understand how something's written. It's a good idea to have a lawyer look it over. Like I think I'm guilty of getting a little bit too comfortable where my lawyer did review the first several deals that I agreed to. And then a lot of them are very similar in how they're worded. So I was like, there's no point in me paying money for this every single time. But because I didn't do that, there are some deals now that, maybe they weren't worded exactly the right way, or you realize that, there's just other things. So I do have relationships with some different people now where I could do like first and seconds, and the interest is not quite as high as it would be on something unsecured, but it's not that far off either. Like you could probably get a second mortgage at like 13.5%. Well, I would rather be secured at 13.5 than maybe unsecured at 16 now that I kind of really understand what can happen if a deal goes bad. So
the first, let's say the first few deals that you did, you weren't as experienced, obviously. Were you just kind of going for the relationship? Like, do you trust this person, or was it a particular deal that you were looking for?
Yeah.
And how has that changed today?
So in the first few years, like I was exclusively through a broker, and I didn't ever know the borrowers. So they could come to him for different reasons. Sometimes it could be for a short-term business loan. It could be maybe they had to wipe their line of credit for a mortgage to close. So it could be something as short as a couple of weeks to 6 weeks, or it could be as long as like a couple of years. So I never really got to know them. Like I did get the deal. They were usually written in such a way that if they defaulted, I could put a lien on a property as leverage. I got their identification. I would look up the property to see if they owned it. In some instances, would look up the equity, just depending on how much money they were asking for and stuff like that. So that was kind of more commonplace. And then as I expanded through KeySpire, I did get to know those borrowers a little bit better because they're real estate investors. Sometimes they're land developers, or they're, rehabbing multifamily properties and stuff like that. So that became different because I was direct to the borrowers in those cases.
Sure. Now, what would be some things that would turn you away from a deal? Like, are there certain red flags that you see, or just things for you personally that you wouldn't go for?
Yeah, there were a couple of deals I turned down earlier on just because the value of the property didn't support how much money the person was looking for. So when my lawyer pulled the property report and the financing background, he could see like someone I think had refied like 5 or 6 times in a short span of time. And it was questionable like how much equity would be there past their mortgage. So I walked away from that one. And I think just also, if there's ever a third party to the agreement, like getting it signed at a lawyer's office, I think is important, just so there's no question of anything or any ill intent. Like a lot of people do use DocuSign and stuff like that now, but at the same time, if you don't know the people on the other end of the deal, like I think it's helpful to have the lawyer manage that. And obviously at the end of the day, like promissory notes are not registered. So just understanding the value of the property, how much is currently debt to equity, and then just understanding, can it afford that? Like there were some deals that I did and I wish I'd looked at more closely because the values of the properties weren't very significant. They could be $200,000 to $300,000. Well, does that then warrant like $100,000 promissory note on top of a mortgage? And then what if there's other promissory note holders, right? So I think just really understanding that there's definitely a lot more questions that I would probably add to my list now that I never thought of before, because one of the brokers I work with were facilitating like very high volumes of these, and now there's a whole bunch of shrapnel as a result.
There's tons of stuff like this in the news. So for prom notes, let's say you do lend money to someone through a prom note, and they default. Obviously, the first mortgage, the second, like anything registered gets paid out, but then what recourse do you have? I'm not sure if you know if you want to pursue that lender.
Yeah, so it's not cheap. I'll say that. The first step usually is to send out a demand letter. I think that's kind of a waste because, of course, they know that they owe you that money already, and you'll probably spend anywhere from a few $100 to $700 on a letter like that. The only way really to secure your interest is to file a claim, and then you can put a notice of pending litigation on a property if it's listed. I do know a lot of borrowers where there was a property listed and it was sold and they weren't even notified. So then that perceived leverage is not even there anymore. But in some cases, the borrower will also personally guarantee the promissory note. So even if maybe the asset doesn't exist within the business, there could be additional recourse that way. But from the lawyers that have advised us now, like that's really the only way to secure your interest. But again, it is contingent on any other first position that they would have ahead of you that have to get paid out.
So you can attach a personal guarantee to a prom note. Yeah. Okay. And then again, if things get really bad and they just refuse to pay for whatever reason, they sell the property. Then are you just suing them personally, or? Well,
you're going through the process of litigation. So if you're in Toronto, that can take 2 years or more. And it really depends on what the question is, right? Like if it's like, I borrowed you money, you're not paying me back, and they're not arguing the fact that they borrowed it, you can potentially get a summary judgment, which can be done in 20 days if they don't file like a defense. Even if they file a defense, the writing's kind of on the wall in that instance, because it's not like they're arguing and saying, no, I didn't borrow this money, right? So, but it's important to note that even if you get a judgment, it doesn't mean you get that money back right away. Like if they're in the process of big refinancing or trying to sell a property, like you can't get blood from a stone. You have to wait until they do that in order to get paid, right? But it's important to still at least have the judgment there, because it does identify your interest, and ideally it would get you paid out when that does happen. And if you don't file anything, then you're at the mercy of the borrower paying you back when that does happen.
Now, again, like you're not a lawyer, so this isn't legal advice or anything, but you seem pretty knowledgeable. Okay, you've got a prom note. They aren't able to pay right away, so it takes a year to refinance the property above and beyond what you had agreed on. And now you borrowed money from your home equity line of credit. You're paying interest on that. What happens with that interest?
I mean, so it's important to note that the interest on your HELOC is tax deductible. So any earnings that you do have is reduced by whatever you pay on your HELOC interest. So that's just as a side. You still need to be able to carry that cost, right? I think that's why diversifying is so important. Like I think anytime I've gone over where my general comfort level is, which is 50,000, it's like more recently there have been some issues. I'm like, like if I only just diversified that much more, I could have that many more deals to support what's now not coming in, right? So I think sometimes the question is, are they defaulting on the payout being delayed, or is it the actual interest payments are falling behind, right? So in a situation like that, technically your interest will continue to accrue for all of those months that they are not paying, right? So if they owed you initially a couple thousand, that could become 12,000 on top of the payout. But I think for the average lender, like the priority is just getting your principal back, right? So I think someone would rather get their principal back than get nothing back. But of course, based on the wording, like they should owe that interest. And in some instances, there could also be NSF fees on top of that. Like one brokerage I had, they charge those as well.
Yeah, that's, it's kind of scary. Well, I mean, obviously, you do a lot of these, but just to think like this borrower, potentially they're not able to pay you back, so they have to refinance, but property values have obviously dropped quite a bit in the last few years. last 2 years, let's say. So if they're not able to pay you back, and then there's all this interest that's accruing, and it's just building up more and more, and then there's NSF fees and lawyer fees and all this, like they probably won't have enough to pay everyone out, right? And
well, that's where it's, I think, important to understand the full landscape of their portfolio before you loan to them, right? Like it's one thing to be like your isolated deal, but do they have a portfolio of 5 million? Is it 20 million? Is it 80 million? And understanding like what the appraisal value is, and then understanding their debt to equity, right? Because in most cases, people assume, well, they're getting these properties probably at like a 75-25 loan to value. Well, what if they're working with someone that facilitated 90-10 or even 100% loan to value, and then the market goes down? Then where does it leave you, right? So I think it's trying to understand the value of that whole portfolio, again, the debt to equity, what that looks like completely. And I think one of the biggest issues some people have had in this last year is that CMHC keeps on changing the rules. So people have gone to it thinking like, I'm going to refi this at 95.5 and a 50-year amortization. But now CMHC is like, well, your first position is no longer an approved lender. You have to go back and wait 2 years and get an approved lender. So people thought like I could pay all these people out, but then these rules changed overnight. So then they're kind of left trying to pivot and come up with new plans and stuff like that. So there are some instances like that we've encountered. So they're not bad people. They're not trying to screw their lenders, but no one expected interest rates to triple. Nobody expected these rules to change, right? So I think you have to try to just be patient and be responsive on both sides. I think where it becomes scary is when a borrower just goes dark, right? And there are some cases like that where someone took litigation, their assets got frozen, and then that borrower dropped off the planet. So all the other lenders are like, what happens now, right? So I think that's like worst case scenario, but in some cases people have been great and they're explaining like the reality of the situation and what their plan is and how they're going to try to make good on what they intended. Yeah.
That's a good point that you brought up about CMHC, because I don't know the exact date, but I think in September 2023, they changed the rule before you were able to refinance if you had a private or a VTB, vendor take back. You can bring that into CMHC, but now you need to have it through an approved lender, and they have on their website all the lenders that they'll work with for a minimum of 2 years. The loan has to be sitting with them before you can bring it into CMHC. So,
exactly.
That's a major change, and that's impacting a lot of people. A lot of people. A lot of people, because a lot of apartment buildings, there is VTB, there's some kind of private financing involved. And if your only exit strategy was to go with that 40 or 50 year AM through CMHC, then you're in some trouble.
Yeah. And I think some of the, resolutions that people have come up with in that case, like they've gotten their approved lender lined up, but then they have all these privates they need to pay out if they did have supplementary financing. So in some instances, they've secured gap funding. So it's almost like getting a line of credit. So it's almost like institutional financing to pay out the privates to just carry them through until that 2 year mark where they can do the complete refi, just so that they're not letting all these smaller groups of private lenders face those challenges.
Right. Yeah. We'll see how things play out. Obviously, I think a lot of people are expecting rates to come down, so that should help.
Yeah. But they're not going to come down to where they were.
No.
They may come down a little. I don't think we're going to see what we saw.
Even
in the
1% would help a lot of people, right? Just help with the cash flow to be able to hold on to these properties for the extra year or two before you can refinance it. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about your goals. So when you started doing private lending or just investing in general, what were you targeting? Was it like a cash flow target that were you trying to supplement your income or just kind of build your wealth?
Yeah. So when I started, I wanted to be less dependent on the income I was drawing from my business, because I knew I was having my daughter and I was going to be, paying extra money to have someone kind of fill my shoes. So I was able to cut my pay in half the year before I went on mat leave, just to have that less of a dependency and leave more retained earnings in the business. And then COVID happened. I didn't want to take anything out. So I was literally able to live off my private lending interest for years. And, I didn't even anticipate to do as much as I did. It just, with having my HELOC and the interest rates being so low, like if you're paying 3% on that money and you're making 20% on a private lend, you're making that difference, then that interest is a tax write-off. That was kind of getting me through those years when I couldn't depend on things with COVID. And then I did have a lump sum that I intended to buy a property with. And I actually put in an offer on a property in Cape Breton. I think it was, I'm forgetting now, like 22 units across 6 properties, like a package of properties. I actually put in a higher offer, and mine wasn't accepted because I would be buying it sight unseen. Because my thought was, well, I'll go there for due diligence. Like, I'm not just going to fly around the country to like every time I put in an offer. And they turned it down. So I was like, maybe there's a reason that this happened and I've got more to learn. So that's when I put kind of a chunk with a brokerage, thinking I'll park it here for a year, give myself the time to just investigate all these different options, right? Like, there's midterm rentals in the southwest of the US that are really attractive. And then there's short-term rentals in various places, multifamily, and like, you know, improving those properties. So I was just trying to build relationships, decide what I wanted to do. And my plan was that when that money came back last summer, then I would move forward. And then everything kind of got extended. And that's kind of where we are at this point in time. But I pretty much came to the conclusion, like, I'm not going to just go buy a multifamily property that I'm going to like demo myself. But I have found really dependable people that have proven systems in place that I could joint venture with. And then ideally, you know, you refi, you can keep on repurposing that capital and grow your portfolio with them. Mm-hmm. So I have a number of different people that I've connected with now over the last couple of years that was my plan, but now it's been on pause while we sort out some of these private lending woes. But that ideally will be the next step when some of this capital comes back.
Right. And all of this has led to you at some point getting your real estate license. So why don't you tell us how you got into real estate as a sales representative? For
sure. So I guess, you know, COVID was kind of underway and we were all in lockdown, and it was one of those things that nobody knew what was happening next, right? So are we going to be in this for a year, 10 years? Like, will events ever come back? And I thought, well, I'm already investing in real estate. Why not get my real estate license and then at least have a backup plan if things don't necessarily come out of the woods sooner than later. So I ended up getting my real estate license, and I committed to two things: getting my real estate license and then publishing my book. I had gone to a writing retreat at the same time that I signed Keyspire, and I wrote most of it, and then I just was at a wall when it came to publishing. So throughout, I guess that was middle of 2020 into beginning of 2021, I would rotate between doing my real estate courses and then editing the book with a publisher, and rotated those till it was completed. So I got my license in spring of 2021, and then my book came out later that year.
Cool. What did you end up kind of writing the book for? Was it just another income source for you, or were you just trying to get a message out there? Yeah.
So I think, a better part of my career, like, I'd always joke that I was an accidental entrepreneur, because most people have this brilliant idea, like they want to have their own business. And I was like, that wasn't my path. Like, I literally fell into it by accident. But I think because of, you know, the challenges that I experienced growing up, it paved that path into entrepreneurship. So I think it was almost like therapeutic to write out all those crazy things that I went through growing up, and then how it really translated into being an entrepreneur and all those lessons that you experience running your own business and stuff like that. So it just, you know, it was kind of a combination of business lessons and memoir, I guess. So I just felt like it was something I had to do. And growing up, people always said, like, your childhood is so crazy, like, you'll have to write a book about this one day. And so I did.
Was it rewarding? Like, I don't know, was it therapeutic? How did you feel getting that message out there?
Yeah, I think it was just something like to help process everything that happened. And I think it really resonated with a lot of people, like, for different reasons. So it's been nice, like, even after the fact, where I've met up with people or had Zoom calls with people and they want to talk about like different things from the book. And, you know, it's been interesting just to see what kind of an impact it's had in that way. But it wasn't necessarily to be like a New York Times bestseller. Like, I self-published. Maybe I would entertain trying to go to a publisher to do that. But for me, it was just something that I felt like I had to do.
Right. And so going back to your real estate career, who do you mostly work with? Are you working with the typical homeowner that's upsizing, downsizing, or are you focusing on investors?
Yeah, I mean, I've only really worked part-time for the last couple of years, because again, I've had the private lending and my daughter was small. So I was like, for the first time in my life, I don't have to kill myself working like 70 hours a week. So I was just enjoying a lot of that time with her. I did find that it was a little bit more challenging than I expected, in the sense that I was used to working with B2B clients. And obviously when you're a residential realtor, you're working more B2C. And I wasn't expecting how emotionally charged some situations would be and just the way some people would be. So I have worked on both sides. Like, I've had listings, I've had buyers. I wouldn't say they're necessarily in one category. Some have been seniors, some have been actually divorcing and stuff like that. Yeah, I think I just have to be very careful with who I'm pre-qualifying, just to make sure I'm not wasting my time with a client that may or may not decide to go ahead as intended. If I could decide in a perfect world what to do, I would prefer to work with investors. Obviously, I'm passionate about that. So I think I'd like to understand land development better to identify opportunities that I could sell through to investors, whether it's bigger properties that they could demolish and build a multifamily on, or maybe they can just, flip the paper and take it to site plan approval or something like that. I'm in Durham, so I'm not going to see there's no opportunities, but it's not really like a hub for that stuff either. So it's just trying to kind of get my footing and see what makes the most sense for me.
Yeah, I think there's this misconception. A lot of people think that being a realtor is really easy. And a lot of people ask me or have asked me in the past about being a realtor part-time.
Yeah.
And I've always said, I don't think it's really much of a part-time thing. It's too difficult to do part-time, and you have a lot of fees. Obviously, it depends on the brokerage that you're with and whatnot, but you're better off doing something else. Just focus on doing something full-time and don't bother being a part-time realtor.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that now that you've been in it for a while?
Yes. I mean, there were some things that I really invested a lot of money on early on. It's not like I was not wanting to work. I believe work gives you a sense of purpose. But I did spend a lot of money on lead gen early on and mail outs. And I wouldn't say that that really translated into much. I ended up getting one sale out of basically each. And I spent probably $20,000 between the mail outs and the lead gen. So now with the brokerage that I'm part of, they own Zoocasa. So I'm joined an agent accelerator program where they give you the leads. They're all pre-qualified and you just pay more on the back end for your commission. Mm-hmm. But I'd rather that. I'd rather have 10 sales that I actually carry through and have that split rather than spend $30,000 and who knows what'll happen.
Right.
I'd say half the leads that came in were not, were just bogus, bad information and stuff like that. And then the one lead gen company that I started with actually sent out an email to my database that was not what was supposed to go out. It was supposed to say who I was, how they know me, why they're getting the email. And it came out really generic, from the brokerage. And I had people freaking out. I had 3 very angry phone calls. I had probably a dozen emails threatening to go to Castle. And I was like, no, but you know me, supposed to be worded a very certain way. And I was able to actually cancel the year contract a few months in because of that. Cause I'm this is supposed to build my reputation. This just destroyed it with a lot of people. Yeah. So that was a bad experience. So then I tested out a different lead gen company that was more seller focused. I wouldn't say that was great. And then I did try the mail outs, but they're very costly. So when you're starting out, that's probably not the best first step.
There's a lot to learn. When you're in real estate, I've been in real estate since 2013. And again, when you start, you get pulled in all these different directions. You don't really know what to do, how you want to run your business, but eventually you figure it out, right? Yeah. You find what works for you. And so with that said, what's next for you? Are you going to continue to work as a realtor? Are you going to go full time? Are you just going to focus more on stabilizing your private lending deals?
A bit of all of it. I mean, I am pursuing things still, in terms of going with the agent accelerator program, because I'm in Pickering. I'm trying to figure out the best way to kind of build up my network there, because with my old agency, I worked with people all across the country. So it's obviously a very different dynamic, because when you're a realtor, you need to really work in your own backyard. You don't want to be driving all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. So I think I just have to suck it up and start door knocking just to make more relationships. Because even though I've lived there for 30 years, I don't know that many people in my community. So just trying to find opportunities to network that way. And now my daughter's in school, so I'm able to connect with other parents and go to kids' birthday parties and all that stuff. On the private lending side, yes, I'm trying to get the capital back that was owed back last year. And ideally, I'm planning to put that into equity. So just figuring out what that next step will be, but on pause in the meantime. And then I have been approached by a few companies just to support some capital raising as a general partner. So ideally, if I can continue to build my portfolio through some of those opportunities, then I would ideally want to do that as well.
Right. And it sounds like at some point you were considering partnering with another investor, maybe bringing the funds once you recoup what you've put out, and growing your portfolio that way. Maybe it sounds like multifamily is kind of what you're thinking. Yeah, I
was looking at multifamily probably in New Brunswick or Alberta. I do have a good relationship with a company that's in 8 markets across Canada, and now they're exploring the States as well, because the cap rates are better and the business laws and tax laws are better. So we'll see what that looks like. But the first step is just making sure all of that comes back relatively unscathed. So,
Yeah. Well, good luck. I hope it all works out. Maybe to finish things off, do you want to tell us a little bit about your podcast? When did you start it? Are you doing it alone or with somebody else?
Yeah. So I never, just like starting a business or running a business, I never intended to do that. Like I started going on podcasts, probably end of 2022 to promote my book. Cause I'm like, well, what better way to promote it than to access other people's networks? And I think I did about 50, and I happened to meet a girl that was helping run another one. And she's like, you should really have your own. And I was like, well, I wasn't trying to do that. But then I had the idea for the title for it, which is Inspired to Invest. And the thought was just trying to show people like investors aren't necessarily special. Like they're all average people, but at some point there was a catalyst that pushed them into this realm, and just to show how they did it, how they tackled it, how it's changed their lives and stuff like that. So it can hopefully inspire other people to take charge. And even if it's a matter of picking up just even one or two more properties, like that can have such a huge impact down the road for you, right? So I do still believe that real estate is probably one of the best vehicles to become wealthy, and just to try to encourage people to explore what those options could look like. So I have been running it on my own. I'm up to my 39th episode this week. So I've been batch recording a few times a year. And so I'm usually recorded like many months ahead of all of that. But because I am in a couple of different networks, like it's like I really haven't had to even reach out to guests. Like I get my intakes filled like months in advance and stuff like that. So it's been interesting. Like I think people are paying attention, and I think it's just another point of differentiation as a realtor. And then potentially if I do end up working towards capital raising, like this is a good platform to get people to know who you are and understand what you're all about.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know if I misunderstood, but it sounds like you said you were featured as a guest on 50 podcasts when you were releasing your book.
Yeah. I've just, even like how we are here today, I had started initially applying to them. And then because I had been on, maybe 10 or 20, then people started reaching out to ask me to be on theirs. So in the last year and a half, I think I've been on about 50.
And did you do this all yourself, or did you hire someone to get you on?
Just me.
So how did you find these podcasts? Just out of curiosity, did you just go on, your Apple Podcasts app or Spotify?
No, not even I think just on social media. Sometimes every time I see a new one, I'll screenshot it and save it as like a folder to look them up. And I would apply that way. I did connect with another girl that she had a list, and we kind of like amalgamated our lists. So now I think we've got a couple hundred on that. Cool. But just, it kind of has happened organically now where people have seen some of those things and we'll just get invited and stuff like that.
Awesome. That's a great result to be on 50 podcasts. That's a lot of exposure. To finish things off, is there anything you feel like we missed? Anything you want to touch on?
I think honestly, the biggest learning that I've had is just, again, the importance of diversification and due diligence. So I still do believe in investing. I think that you just need to be careful. Like obviously nobody ever wants to lose any money. I think there's still a lot of great opportunity. You just have to find the right people to work with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's obviously, like you said, most investors are just regular people. They're, we're depicted as investors a certain way.
Yeah.
And, a lot of tenants and people think that we're just greedy, wealthy people, but that's generally not the case. We're just trying to create a better situation for our families. So you definitely have to be careful, and one bad deal can really turn you off to investing. So just be careful and do your due diligence. So I appreciate everything you've shared. Just to end things here, do you want to tell people how they can reach you and what services you might be providing?
For sure. So obviously I've got my real estate profile, so it's under Serena Homes Realtor. And then I also have one for my podcast, which is under Inspired to Invest podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Serena. I appreciate your time. Thanks for listening to this episode. Your support is truly appreciated. And if you can share this with a friend or family member that might benefit from the information, remember, our goal is to motivate and inspire others to take action and to build wealth and to become well off. Enjoy the rest of your day.